Welcome, everybody. Um, we want to invite you to start with a song with us. You're all muted, and so we encourage you to, have a little party in your own living room and sing along. We're going to do the song Guide My Feet, which comes out of the African American spiritual tradition. It's a pre-slavery song. I also just want to give us all a reminder that not all of us run races and use feet. We could sing Guide My Wheels or however. So with that invitation, I'm going to sing. I got a cold, so the bar is set low, friends. Feel no fear. Guide my feet while I run this race. Guide my feet while I run this race. Guide my feet while I run this race, for I don't want to run this race in vain, race in vain. Stand with me while I run this race. Stand with me while I run this race. Stand with me while I run this race, for I don't want to run this race in vain, race in vain. Pray, pray with me while I run this race. Pray with me while I run this race. Pray with me while I run this race, for I don't want to run this race in vain, race in vain. Welcome.
Just want to extend gratitude for the song, for sure, to Reverend Ashley Horan. And one thing I just want to mention for folks who may not be familiar with the Zoom format is that there is a chat that we invite everyone to give feedback in, ask questions, type responses in as we go through this. So wanted to talk a little bit about what prompted us to offer this webinar. It basically came out of a group of clergy folks and faith leaders in Minneapolis, where I live, where Ashley Horan is based out of as well. And there really was a need for support just around not only logistical sharing of information, but also recognizing this as a moment in our history where we can really interrogate some ideas about power, both externally and internally, in order to build a resistance for the years to come. And not just resistance, but also resilience, and how we're going to have to lean into each other in new ways if we're going to be able to do that effectively. So with that, myself and a group of clergy and faith leaders put together two separate 3-hour trainings. And those consisted of 3 segments. The first was interrogation of power, presenting some ideas about power based out of the book This Is an Uprising by Engel and Engel. I highly recommend everybody read that. It's got some really powerful resources for just to begin thinking about this, both for folks who may be new to this type of resistance and being in the movement, and also new folks. And just want to thank Caitlin Breedlove and Nora Rasman for introducing me to that book through their Organizing on the Side of Love class earlier this year, or earlier last year now. So we were able to train about 200 folks in Minneapolis and St. Paul, and we're hopeful that this webinar will be accessible to more people, and it includes some of what we covered. Though we can't really do self-defense classes over the internet, although maybe somebody knows how to do it, it's just not us. So that's a little bit about why we decided to come together and offer this up more on the eve of the march, in the days before the march, I should say, and then afterwards to come back together to do a theological debrief together. So
Yeah, and the format. Thank you for that, Lena, and for all of the ways in which we get to collaborate, to Nora and Caitlin too. Um, the format for tonight, we're gonna kind of do just like a dialogue between us all. And one of the pieces that feels important to say about that is that all of us are in some extent organizers of faith people in our professional work right now. I'm the only one on the panel who's a ordained minister, but one of the beautiful pieces of our tradition is that we all have access to being theologians. And one of the things we want to do tonight is help build some of the muscles around being able to code switch between sort of movement speak, political speak, and theology. And when I say theology, I mean talking very deeply about things that are of ultimate meaning and worth, our deepest commitments. And it turns out, actually, that when we're talking about politics and organizing, or when we're talking about theology, both of those sort of sides of the tree have the same root, which is our deep commitments, the values that we hold most sacred. And so we're going to kind of try and model what it looks like for people to talk in the same conversation at the same time with both a political and a theological lens on things. So you'll see some of that tonight, and feel free and put your questions in the chat box as we go.
Great. Hi, good evening. I'm Nora Rassman, and I'm just going to give you a little overview of kind of some resources that we're recommending folks check out, as well as how the evening will go. The logistical stuff, as Lena noted, you are muted, and this is a webinar format, so unfortunately we don't get to see your faces. But we would love for you to post in the chat box. There's also a Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to use either, and I'll be monitoring them and feeding the info to Lena, Ashley, and Caitlin. We will ask you to possibly write something down. So if you have pen or paper or something, or if you like to visualize, then you're ready to go. And we'll have a couple prompts that all three of them will respond to, and then we'll solicit some of your feedback around. A couple things that we wanted to call your attention to in coming weeks and days were a de-escalation and confrontation video that we created with Caitlin right after the election. And we'll be sending all this info is available on the Standing on the Side of Love page as well. I'm trying to add in the chat box myself. Secondarily, there are a lot of things happening here in DC, which is where Lena and I are right now. And one of those things is a UU Convergence at the Women's March. And I'm really excited that we've been able to work with some local and regional clergy to really pull it together. I think it's going to be rad. The third thing I like to call your attention to is a teach-in that's taking place this Saturday at All Souls Church Unitarian, which is one of the 3 UU churches in DC proper. And there's a really extraordinary panel that's happening around 3 on Saturday called Organizing on Safety Pins and Needles. That's going to be featuring our colleague at the UUA, Didi Delgado, as well as Leslie Mack, who's one of the co-founders and organizers of Black Lives of UU. And I think it's going to be great. So if you're coming to DC and available to stay around Saturday afternoon, that would be awesome, and we would love to have you there. And lastly, there is a bystander intervention training that Lena offered from a colleague in Minneapolis named Jess Banks. And we think that that would probably be a helpful resource for you as well. So I know that's a lot of information. It might be hard to grab the stuff from the chat box, so don't worry. We'll get the information to you, but wanted to just flag it because we think that complementing this conversation, there's probably a lot of other questions that are bubbling up for folks, and we know that this is not the easiest way to engage with new content, so we'd like to get it to you always possible. So with that, I think I'm gonna turn the mic over to Ashley.
Thanks, Nora. So as Nora mentioned, we unfortunately can't do like breakout groups or small reflection circles, which would be ideal, but we do want to start with giving everybody a minute to do some reflection. As I said a second ago, both sort of political organizing speak and theological speak are different languages for speaking about our deepest values and commitments. And so, you know, what's interesting is that the left sort of ceded the rights to speaking about morality and values to the radical right, both the religious right and the political right. Certainly during the 1980s and 90s, and I would argue that it's still happening today. And so I think it's actually a really important tool that the left learned to speak about values instead of just about rights, because it turns out that, you know, many of us are not just operating like if we had all the right information, we would have perfect politics. Anybody who's tried to have a conversation and, you know, tell somebody about the statistics on something and have had them been totally recalcitrant about it knows that facts are not actually a good conversion tool. But values language is really good for opening people's hearts and building relationships. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a couple of minutes and just take some deep breaths together. And then I want to invite you to find a piece of paper or just sit with your eyes closed, however you process best. And we'd like you to brainstorm for a few minutes. Sorry, folks, excuse me. We want you to brainstorm what are the values and the deepest commitments that are bringing you to space to going to this march, whether you're going in your hometown or in DC. What are the deepest values and commitments that are motivating you to enter into that space with so many people this weekend? So we're going to start with a couple of deep breaths together. I'd invite you to just find a way to feel grounded. And let's take a breath in and out. In and out. In and out. And then when you feel ready, I invite you to start your brainstorm either on your own paper or in your head. And we're going to give you 2 full minutes of silence to do that. And at the end of that time, we'll invite you to share some of those in the chat box, just a word or a phrase. So let's start our 2 minutes, and I'll time on my phone here. For I don't want to run this race in vain. If you would take a second and, if you're comfortable, chat us a couple of the words or phrases that represent the values that are bringing you to this march and this political moment. If you're not watching the scroll, it's pretty great. Look over in your chat box.
Yeah, maybe we can read some of them off, since I'm not sure that the chat translates into the recording. Do you know, Nora?
I think we can save it, but definitely you can save
Oh, we can save it. That's cool. I'm just seeing stuff like compassion, justice, deep listening, solidarity with other women and our allies. Just a lot of women's issues, environmental issues.
Inherent worth and dignity of all people. Democracy and resistance. Solidarity. Mm-hmm.
Care for
yeah. And I want to push you all, those of you who listed an issue, to think about what is the value that pushes you to care about issue, effective justice or the environment or immigration. Why? What's the deeper moral or spiritual commitment that you have? Is it because you do in fact believe that all of us are born from love and deserve love? Is it about choice as a value and freedom, liberation? Try and see if you can get down one more layer from that issues level. Thank you for all of these. You can continue to put these in the chat box throughout the evening tonight, and we will.
Oh, I think you got muted, Ashley, before you finished speaking.
Oh, sorry, I was just saying we will keep coming back to them in the conversation tonight, and we'll use them at the end. So keep chatting them as you think of them. And I think I'm turning it.
Hi, everybody. It's great to read everybody's chat. My name's Breedlove. I have an ongoing cold, so I'm doing my best to participate and also just in support of the co-panelists here. So since we have so many people on this webinar, we wanted to be able to round robin a little bit, like Ashley brought up, around really some of the discussions that we had in prepping for this and the discussions that came out of the work that our folks have already done in Minneapolis. We know that a lot of people are preparing to go to the march. There's expectation of huge numbers of folks, and that we've also heard a lot of hunger to get to hear us talk and invite more conversations between more of us about this political moment and the spiritual moment, which we see as really connected. So a couple things about this political moment that, again, we're not saying this needs to be everybody's frame, but we think it's really important to invite discussion in this time. So one thing I want to start by talking about is how prevalent and clear it is right now that there is pressure to create a culture of fear, political fear in particular, and we know that political fear is personal fear for people who are being targeted and will be targeted every day by Trump's incoming regime. So a couple of things I want to say about that, just to start with the personal. All the community organizing that I've ever done has been in quote unquote red states, which for the point of this discussion means it's places that have been either little bit hostile to very, very hostile to myself as a queer person and pretty much everybody I've worked with. And I bring that up not because I think this moment is equivalent, but I heard many people in Arizona and in states like Georgia and Alabama, people I love, talk about how when Trump won, there was a huge experience where a lot of people in the country felt like we became a whole set of red states. We know that, you know, some of our local politics make that different. We can stand up and fight and do local work, but we are going to be dealing with a quote unquote administration that is very, very different from what has come before in some ways, in other ways not, but in some very significant ways. And one of the things that I've always found in organizing is that I was never a very courageous person, like by myself, but I learned courage from other people. And the more that I kept moving with it, the more that we had, right? And so I just want to name that I think it's really important for us to think about where are the places, where is this march an opportunity, and where are the other places in our lives where we're able to build community around courage itself and community in action. Because the other thing that can happen, which I think is really important when we talk about radical honesty in this political moment, is that the more buffered we are, or the more we give into fear, we can also create communities of cowardice. It's very possible. And the more privilege we have, and often if we are not used to being targeted for our political beliefs, it's very easy to give into fear. Our fears are real. And we can be around, encourage each other to be fearful, or we can encourage each other to be courageous. And we have choices in that. It doesn't mean we have choices in everything we're facing all the time. So politically, we think that's a really important thing to talk about right now. Another thing we want to talk a little bit about is, what does non-compliance mean in this time? Lena had brought up a really great point when we were talking the other week about how a lot of the frame has been civil disobedience, but now we're entering a point of non-compliance. So one example I would use from this week, some people who know me know that part of my family is from Eastern Europe, and I study politics a lot. It happens there. One of my favorite writers is the writer Masha Gessen. She now lives in New York. She's one of the best known Russian LGBT dissidents under Putin's regime. And one of the things she said in an article talking about John Lewis and Trump this week is, quote, "The language of ideals and principles gives way to the language of realism and action under autocracy," right? Which is under dictatorship, neo-fascisms, etc. And part of why she was naming that was really important was she was talking about the kind of non-compliance that people can do from a spiritual and moral frame, in whatever way those terms make sense to them. And looking at the history of how a lot of times in political rhetoric, Trump's response to things that are about principles, ideals, our deepest meanings, the way that Ashley defined theology, right? The things that mean the most to us as people, is to say, that's all talk. It's, we need to be action oriented. We need to be realistic. And so remembering that when we think about what are the ways in our daily life that we can choose to not comply with what I would call evil in our world and in our time, I think there's also a question of, inside of that non-compliance, what does it look like to think about doing that in a loving way and holding up our highest ideals and seeing and asking ourselves questions about what we are not going to comply with. And so the final third thing that I would add, and Masha Gessen also interestingly describes that kind of, she doesn't use the word non-compliance, but that kind of continuing to hold up the highest ideal as a bridge to the future. And for those of us who are thinking a lot about ourselves, our kids and our grandkids right now, and our elders, and how we're going to get from here to what comes next, both making it through and moving forward, I think that's really important. And then the final thing I'd just say is, how are we thinking about how we, speaking of, how are we thinking about a bridge to the future for this little fantastic person and all the other little fantastic people? I think that there's also a really important thing when we're thinking about our own local communities and our local lives. We're going to talk a little bit at the end. We hope you'll join us for a debrief after the march. But we see this as a really important opportunity to invite ourselves into covenant around what 4 years of noncompliance could look like for us, and what does that look like in an idea of where we actually live, in our neighborhoods, in our congregations, in our towns and cities. We're going to need some really different definitions of leadership right now that are not just about, national folks who've been doing this work a long time, got a lot to say. I use people like me saying stuff. But also, what is it that people can really do where they are? And actually, I think that's one of the things that I've seen build the most courage, is when people see the folks in their neighborhoods and their communities moving and organizing. It's like, oh, that's not some faraway thing that only someone else can do. That's something I can do right here. It's something I can do that's an antidote for the cynicism, the kind of denial, or two other really important things that happen often under dictatorships and autocracy, which is, one is called internal immigre, which means you take your values and you move them inside and you stop talking about them. So you might think what's happening down the street is wrong, but you're self-censoring to not say it. And the other is self-censoring itself, right? So actually, which we're starting to see already, to be honest, I think in some very large, powerful institutions are already predicting Trump's going to come down on us for this. So we're no longer even seeking the line of what is noncompliance. They're ready to comply right now. And the deeper that we can do work to be honest about that, the more that we can have honest conversations about how we not comply. So I'm going to stop with that, but that's a couple of the ideas we were thinking about, and pass it back to you.
Excuse me while I cough. Yeah, Caitlin, I think that is such important stuff, and about Sharon Welsh's seminal theological work, A Feminist Ethic of Risk. But this, some of the central ideas that come out of that work and that I think we need to really be exploring right now theologically are like, what are we willing to risk, and who does that risk prioritize, or what does it prioritize, right? So like, I used to be a kid who was like super afraid of getting in trouble with the teacher. And there were a couple of instances where like, my friends wanted to just like do something that are without having won the wrath, because I was so afraid of getting in trouble. And the value under that for me was always like respectability, looking at privileges that being good gave me. And what I noticed that is there were like the times in my life, I started noticing a pattern of when I was actually willing to take those risks were when there was something that, excuse the double entendre here, but when there's something that trumped my need to look good and my need to be safe personally. And so, if there was something that was or like said something really offensive, I was at that point, like I found my courage muscles, right? And like I was able to step up. And I think we need to be doing that on a mass scale, which is again why this conversation around what are the deepest values, literally the things that we would risk our 1C3 status in our churches for. What would we, risk being audited by the IRS for? What would we be willing to be arrested for, or to, even be subjected to violence for? And the answer is that there are very few things that are just personal that we would do that. Most people would answer their kids or the immediate people in their family. But I think what we're talking about here is like developing those muscles of, as Marge Piercy, the poet, would say, know who you mean when you say we, and each day you mean one more. And that deep theology of interconnection, that deep theology of collective liberation, which I always say that this, way activists talk about collective liberation is actually, that's the political language for what we call universal salvation in our tradition. This idea that actually we're not concerned with whether God loves us or not, or whether we're going to hell or not, because we know we're all saved already, right? That's our Christian tradition thread on the universalist side. And so what that means then is, if that's not the concern is how do we create, develop, build the kingdom of God here on earth? And how do we understand ourselves to be so inextricably interconnected that we would be willing to risk all of those things through noncompliance, through resistance. And I think getting over that respectability politics and the fear, being institutionalist for the sake of being institutionalist, our church has to survive no matter what, I think is not going to equip us for bravery and boldness.
Yeah. And so one, I just want to recognize that some folks are having trouble with audio, and I just want to encourage folks, you can mute your video so that you can just hear us. Sometimes that helps. And panelists, we can do the same to try and help with the audio. So please do let us know if people continue to have trouble with that. So just wanted to mention that. And then, excuse me, I also have a cold. And so I think earlier Caitlin mentioned that we're just going to invite folks to think about or noodle on some concepts of power. And, we're not asking folks to adhere to them or anything, but they're just really good things to sort of think about, given the election and the times that we find ourselves in. So in order to do that, I'm going to rely on some really, some good tools from the book, This is an Uprising, and that are two notions of power that the book explores really thoroughly. Specifically in chapter 4, it's called The Pillars, and they really deal with this one idea of power as a monolithic force. It's kind of what we're taught in school, that the government has a monolithic power over everyone. It's based on force, it's based on coercion, it's based on, if you don't do this, you will face this consequence. And it can seem as if it's an impenetrable force, this sort of monolithic notion of power. Something that a lot of social movements rely on is a different theory of power, a power that says that political power is positioned and held up by social power, by people, basically. So, there's a really good quote, and I don't know, Nora, if you have those available to screen share, but I'd like to lift one up, and if you can, find it, there's the one, the first one that's about the institutions of power and the way it works. Go to the next one. Oh, there you go, that one. So this, and I'll just read it for folks. It says, the military, the media, the business community, the churches, labor groups, the civil service, the educational establishment, and the courts, among others, are pillars that lend structural stability to a political system. These are all bodies that in one way or another provide a regime with the backing it needs to survive. The pillars concept offers a catchy visual metaphor for the social theory of power. Imagine the various institutions of society as columns holding up the roof of a Roman temple. Social movements are pulling at the various columns. If they remove one or two of the pillars of support, the building would be weakened, but it might still stand. However, if people pull out enough of the pillars, the temple is sure to topple and the movements will triumph. And in the book, they really explore actually some movements that have successfully done this, including in Serbia and in other places, and they really explore and apply this social theory of power. You can go to the next slide, Nora. So then they go on to say, when it comes to the workings of civil resistance, a faith in the monolithic power of those at the top is not the only thing that mainstream operatives get wrong, just as they regularly fail to appreciate when the pillars holding up the status quo have grown dangerously weak. They often overlook the types of challenges most likely to begin wearing away at these fortifications. Certainly, that was the case with the British Empire's rulers in India. Try as they might, they could not see why Mohandas Gandhi would choose to stake his political career on the most absurd and tangential of issues, namely salt. And you can come back to us for a minute, and then we can go into the next slide. But what they're really talking about there, they go on to talk about how a lot of Gandhi is pushing for Indian folks, because what was happening during the British rule in India was it was illegal for Indians to mine and produce their own salt, and so what Gandhi did was use that as a mobilization of people to start to get them to believe in their own sense of power. And the British government couldn't really see why this was important to the movement and why he stuck to it so much. But eventually they were like, okay, fine. Well, they made some concessions around the legality of Indians really being able to mine their own salt and have access to it. And so what the result was of that, which was totally unanticipated by the British government, was that actually millions of people started believing that, oh, I have power to affect something, and I can do this in a collective, in a group. I can do something that I can't, am not able to do on my own. So it really pushed people to think about that social theory of power, and do more than think about it, but to really live into it. And now there were severe consequences for it, right? They were beaten, they were jailed, they lost their jobs. Lots of things happened, but they were willing to make that sacrifice because they started to really feel what a lot of us, I think, as myself, indeed have felt in moments of mass mobilization or being in a direct action. There's actually a tangible feeling of power that you can feel, that with a prolonged and dedicated strategic movement can really challenge political power, especially when it's been really abusive. So if we can go back to that slide, I have found, and I'm forgive me because I've forgotten where I've learned it now, but there's two slides. One is of a triangle. It's just the next one. There we go. That this is kind of the monolithic notion of power, that it's very stable structure, right? A triangle is pretty hard to take apart. It's pretty impenetrable. But what the social theory of power is encouraging us to think about, and you can go to the next slide, is that this is actually something more akin to what our power structure looks like. And in that first quote, those sort of sticks or pillars are those things that were mentioned in that first quote: the civil institutions, the churches, the labor movements, stuff like that, that actually give a political regime its power. So if we start to knock at those, and really non-compliance is a way to move into those, we pull those pillars out and we can actually take back some of the power. You can go to the next slide. And again, this is just an invitation to think about. The book goes on to give a lot of analysis from different social movements to say, as it turns out, this accepted vision of how political change occurs has serious flaws. And in this specific piece, they're talking about the monolithic notion. At best, it presents an incomplete picture of how progress in our society is won. At worst, it is a wrong-headed story that stubbornly conceals the way in which many of the most significant gains of the past century have been secured, from women's suffrage to labor laws to civil rights. It misses how people with few material resources and little access to conventional power brokers have sometimes been able to bring about transformations that mainstream politicians consider to be absurd and impractical, right up until the moment when these changes become common sense. So there's that really important piece of it. And I think if you can just go to the last slide, second to the last slide, and we'll end actually on that one. this one, I really lift out this quote because it's been my lived experience that when people wake up to the true power that they possess, this theory argues they can often defy expectations of political experts, and sometimes they can even surprise themselves. And we can be done with the slides now. I think I just really like to lift up that quote because it really is just talking again about how the social theory of power, the more you start to think about it and or see if it works, the more we can really understand that ourselves as individual people, we have that power, and it's lived in our everyday lives, and it's lived in that non-compliance piece, right? So I think I think that's the invitation, is to sort of think about this monolithic notion of power versus a more social theory of power, and how to connect that to our sense of spirituality as you use in the world. How do we fortify ourselves to be able to do this work, to be thinking more and living more into a social theory of power, and how do we support each other in that, building new networks that haven't existed before, and how do we use this moment, specifically the Women's March on Washington, as a moment to build up those networks and those supports. So you can take the slide off, Nora. Now you can give us back our lovely faces. So. And that's the end of my invitation to think about social theory of power versus a more monolithic notion.
I think we're going to Ashley now.
Sure. Hold on a second. I'm trying to mute the right things. Let's try it this way.
Well, while you
you're having trouble hearing me, sorry.
Oh, no worries. We can hear you, but while you do that, I will just mention that there's a really good article. Maybe Nora can put the link in the chat box by Kila Akunu that talks about this idea of noncompliance and building resilient communities and what that looks like. He's an organizer out of Mississippi with the Jackson Cooperative and a bunch of other amazing organizations doing really, really good work. And in there, he really also talks about too, that was the other quote that I kind of skipped over because we have shorter time here, where he talks about that as the left, we are muscles of sort of working through and supporting each other across lines of disagreement are kind of anemic, and we need to really focus on how do we strengthen those muscles. And we've even seen this with the Women's March on Washington, right? We have the very beginning, a group of white women saying we want to do this, and then we have a critique and women of color and indigenous women and Black women speaking truth to their experiences, saying some of this isn't right to us and we feel hurt or harmed. And then you have some white women saying, oh, well, then we're going to walk away from this because we don't. And not all of them, but certainly some of them did. And so one of the things we're going to have to think about is how do we strengthen that muscle to work through that? And the phrase that I learned from Caitlin Breedlove, the beautiful phrase of disciplined conflict, to really work through issues with each other in a loving way, but not shy away from them or pretend like they don't exist, so that we can be more inclusive of trans women and women of color and, working class folks who haven't had as much voice in our movements. Certainly.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about the ways in which we sometimes tend to really flatten our identity differences in Unitarian Universalism. We're really comfortable being, we're comfortable being convinced that we're all middle class and that we are all like, we can't actually come up with enough resources in our congregation, and that, you know, all LGBTQI people are welcome here and all people of color are welcome here. You know, what's wrong with our marketing program? And I think one of the things that comes out of that is a really wishy-washy theology of covenant. So this idea that like, everybody is welcome here, and there's an unspoken expectation of assimilation. Everybody's welcome here if you behave, look, act, speak in XYZ ways. It also means that I've heard so many Unitarian Universalists say, you can believe whatever you want here, and you know, how could we ask somebody to leave the church? Or like, how could we do something that was anti-Trump? What if there are anti-Trump people in our congregation? We might scare them away. And I always come back to this idea that like, when we say we affirm the inherent worth and dignity of all people, it does not mean that we affirm the inherent worth and dignity of all policies, behaviors, and opinions. We have to have real moral clarity. And that's actually the kind of assimilation that we should be practicing rather than cultural assimilation, is that like, no, actually you're not welcome here if you think that Black people are inferior to any other group. We'd love to work with you and have conversations about that, but like our actual priority is not doing that conversion work all the time, but like actually asking who we double down with. If we proclaim that Black Lives Matter, or that reproductive justice matters, or that, you know, any of these various issues that we might call ourselves out to, I think we've got a responsibility then to not get so wishy-washy about like, well, what if somebody's upset about us taking a stand? You know, and so this comes up, for example, around the issue of policing. And I'm thinking about so many conversations I've had in our congregations where they say, you know, you're talking about like abolishing the prison industrial complex. I know so many good cops, or I'm a good cop. And I would say like, Universalism taught us hundreds of years ago that actually we're not worried about individual salvation. So we're not actually talking about individual cops. We're talking about a system, right? And so from that Universalist theology, what it means is that we are called and compelled to go after the systems that prevent any individual or group of people from living into the inborn, God-given, change your language how you want, potential for flourishing. And so instead of doing the internal debate about like, you know, can we have this sign up on our congregation, or can we co-sponsor this event? I think the question from liberation theology, which is the Catholic strand of theology that comes to us, that I think we need to read God's preferential option for the poor. And I think we can expand that to all marginalized groups. But it's deeply embedded, this idea that actually what is true and right and holy is making the choice to live in and work for solidarity with frontline communities. And so if we, go down the alleys about like, who's going to be mad at this? What if our pledge drive fails because we hang up the Black Lives Matter banner? Or if we go to this march, or if we offer, sanctuary to this person or whatever. Those are the things I hear all the time. And I always come back with like, well, what is our deepest value? Is it keeping our church alive? Or is it expressing our values and our theology through an unwavering choice to do what we can where we are in solidarity with the communities of people who are being attacked by the state? So we can love individual police officers, for example, while also saying, no, policing harms all people, including the people who are participating in it. Work is to hold the contrast of those things, right? Like the love for individuals, while also saying we're working on chipping away at these pillars with whatever tools we've got.
Thanks, Ashley. Yeah, so I think that, as we're getting more towards the end of our time, wanting to help invite people to take some of these like bigger ideas and how do we focus it towards thinking about the march and the steps coming ahead. One of the things that I think is really exciting actually about the process of the march is some of the information that Lena just gave. I actually think it's inside of the struggle for, really inside the struggle for power, and who has the power to call for mass mobilization, and who is the wider we that needs to be calling for that. That's exciting about it. I'm excited to be supporting people participating because of that. I think one of the things that I've learned in organizing that I think is really helpful, and I think it's also helpful in some of the faith contexts, is that we used to say this thing like, people come to organizing shops, which I don't know, how much folks have worked with community organizations, but most of them that are grassroots are pretty ragtag and kind of come in a very capitalist way, like it's Burger King, like I want a cheeseburger, I want onions, hold the mustard, here's the ketchup. And they're putting the order into a person who is doing 15 people's jobs, right? Inside of some nonprofit structure where there's peanuts for money anyway, right? And you have this dynamic wherein people come into organizing, whether it's something like what we would call a mass-based tactic, which is just a way to talk about a mass-based march or any part of a strategy that involves a lot of people. So whether it's a rally or a group or a campaign or whatever, like, hey, this is how I want it. This is how I want it to go. And we know that that also has a lot to do with privilege, right? Because people are, the more privilege that we have, often the more individualized we are used to our experiences being tailored. Because we have access to spaces where we can have things the way we like them, and we often have resources to have things the way we like them. So in the coming time, I'm curious what it would look like for a lot of us to start to engage with things we participate in, starting with the march, as though we want those things to succeed for all of the people involved in them in the best way possible to shift the course of history. Not as though we want them to succeed in the individual ways that work best for us. Not as though we're interested in them being, the best individual photo opportunity for us. We need to have our individual experience, but we're hoping that when we engage in this kind of work, we get to work on growing our muscles around what does it mean to actually transform the shape of history. I saw someone in the comments say, when Lena was talking about this as an uprising, do we want to destroy the society or take apart the structures of society? No, we want them to be transformed, though. They need to be transformed. And the reason that we are so incredibly sure, I am so incredibly sure they need to be transformed, is that me and almost everyone I love, they have not been working for from the day we were born. From the moment that my family came to this country, even in the perversity that the privileges of being a white immigrant bring, like from everything, from queerness to criminalization, across the board. If we're wondering if they need to be transformed, if we were wondering that before Trump won, then this should be a time when, again, as Ashley brought up, maybe we're not always engaging the people who don't think they need to be transformed, because the information we know is that a huge number of people think they need to be transformed. Thousands of those people are headed to DC. And people have a great deal of clarity. So I think that it's very disingenuous to say like there's any silver lining to Trump winning. There's not. I do think, however, that the opportunity for seeing the interconnections between the communities who are being targeted has never been so clear in such a practical way in my lifetime. It is just so clear that we can look at the rhetoric or we can look underneath the rhetoric, and underneath the rhetoric is a message that the president-elect of this country is passing forward to us, which is that in order to make America great again, some of us, and I'm not talking about people out there, I'm talking about some of us on this webinar, need to die, be incarcerated, or be completely silenced, right? That our cultures, our sense of meaning, the things that give our families and communities sustenance need to cease in order for other people to live in the way that they want to do so. And having that kind of clarity of message, I think, is going to be really important as we move forward politically, because there's going to be a lot of conversations about shifting message, quote unquote, is he going to do what he says he's going to do? But there's critical information where the message is already clear in the big picture about what needs to happen. So our work then doesn't become questioning how bad does that get, considering all the things we're already seeing happening. Our work becomes finding each other who want to covenant for resistance and noncompliance for the next 4 years. Finding each other who see that there's a spiritual imperative to behave as though we're interconnected, who want to look back on these 4 years, not around individual heroics or saying we did something, but around the actual humility of what it takes to have enough people to change things in any county, in any town, in any city, in any state. And finding each other who, in times of isolation and despair, are engaging with the idea that we're not alone. And so we're hoping that the frame of finding each other, building relationships, building our covenants with ourselves and each other, building our relationships with the people that we go to DC with, that we come home with, that we meet while we're there, how we show respect for the communities who are directly affected in DC. And I'm talking about, you know, an economy where Black folks make up a huge part of the population, and their businesses don't get the play they need, that there's religious discrimination and discrimination against poor people and queer and trans people every single day. How do we show up with our best and strongest values, that this feels like this is a first opportunity for the long-term building? So I think those are some of the things that we're just sitting with and have been talking about as we're moving forward. And I'm going to pass back to Lena.
Yeah, I think this time is also going to call us to have a lot of courage. And, you know, I'll just speak from, my lived experience that this moment is a bittersweet moment for me. And this is something I shared on my interview with NPR on Sunday, and something I will continue to lift up. You know, many of us have been in the streets for years and speaking the truth and resisting our own oppressions. You know, I've came to a lot of my organizing work through the Black Lives Matter movement, and watched, painfully so, as many of you wouldn't join us in the streets. And also thankful for those who did, who found the courage and the uncertainty and the ambiguity to join us. And so the bittersweet part of it is that a lot of folks are beginning to see or beginning to feel compelled and convicted to join us in this resistance now. And, you know, that's an important thing to hold on to. And so it's going to really take, it's going to take a lot of courage for people to step into that. It's going to take us really asking the questions of what are we called to risk in terms of our communities and our personal safety. It's going to call us to think through and about those questions. I wanted to share too with people that I've seen a lot of comments, and some of them are going by too quickly to catch, but for like concrete examples and more direction and more things. And I really just want to lift up a tool that I think is a very comprehensive and really good tool for folks. It's called the Safety Pin Box. And I don't know, I can put a link in there for folks to the website. But it's, or maybe I can't, maybe Nora can help me out. It just told me I couldn't. But this is actually a box that's called Effective Accountable Allyship. And it was made by Marissa Johnson and Leslie McFadden. And it's really a tool that you can subscribe to it. There's all different levels of subscription and a lot of different price ranges. And it really takes you through a lot of some of the things we've gone through on this webinar and more. And it really gives you tools for evaluating your own life, your own community, and how you can reach out and build these networks that we're talking about building in, you know, as we go to the Women's March on Washington too as well. So I just really want to live that up. And then, you know, circle back to this piece about, I really love what you said earlier, Ashley, about, you know, in movement speak, we often talk about our collective liberation, and how you broke that down into theological thinking about, you know, universal salvation. And, you know, I continue to say and to push people to think about, are they in this movement to make themselves feel good, to assuage some of their fears and worries, which I'm not judging anybody. Like that's certainly some of the reasons I came into movement, right? And also how are you connecting your liberation to my own, right? You know, Caitlin talked about, you know, this country has never worked for a lot of folks. And for me, it didn't work for folks who even came before me, right? In my slave ancestry and my indigenous ancestry. And so how are we really connecting and understanding our own identities, whatever they may be, as connected to, as, you know, intertwined with people who are oppressed by a lot of structures. And I will say this too, you know, the piece about the transformation, that a lot of things need to be transformed. They do. And that is going to require that we say some things must be destroyed, right? Like the excessive use of police force and violence, that has to go away. That has to stop in order for us to build a collective liberation. And we need to transform it into something else, right? Whatever that model looks like, community policing, et cetera. So, I know that's a little bit all over the place, but I just want to lift those threads up and also talk about that we actually, by building up webs of networks and community that are separate from and not reliant on government, which our faith community actually is really set up really well to do, is going to be really important in the coming years and you know, times ahead. And for some of the concrete example of that, I think about all of the people who said if there's a Muslim registry, they're going to, you know, they're going to sign up on it and use their name. And that's a really good thing to say. And my question that I posit to people is, are you going to continue to be signed up for it when they bring you up on federal charges for fraud, or when you get put in jail? Who's going to take care of your children? Or if you're taking care of aging parents, right? These are the sorts of things that, who's going to help you pay for your legal defense? These are the sorts of things that as a UU community, I feel like we can be really well situated to support each other through, right? Because we are a faith community. I know that when I had to have just, you know, a back surgery, it was my UU community that came through with meals, rides to the doctors, stuff like that. And so if we can begin to think about our resistance in terms of those covenants we've made with each other for things, you know, of that nature, if we can build that up, then we're going to be in a much better position to be set up to offer sanctuary, or to be set up to actually affect a Muslim registry, things like that. And I think that our communities, you know, it's going to take some work and some compassion and love and grace, but I think we can do it. And I think we're trying to start with things like this, with coming to the, you know, March on Washington, and then with getting together afterwards to really work through it and be in community with each other.
Can I jump in with something real quick here? Lena, I think lifting up safety pin box is so awesome. And I think there are resources for both individual and collective action in that. And I think that's super important. And I just want to be really explicit that we need to be doing both personal work and organizing, right? So an example of the way that we're organizing churches here in the Twin Cities right now is we're at the beginning of a project to create what we're just like in a draft calling a safety net, where we're going to do some what organizers would call asset mapping of a congregation, and of in fact a large number of congregations, and we're going to ask them to make commitments in advance for the mobilization of their resources for the movement. So things like, do you have free office space that you would offer to emerging, collectives of people? Will you let somebody use your copy room one day a month? How quickly could you raise $1,000? Could you start a reserve fund that's ready to move? Could you do a tithe of your budget to movement organizations and deep partnerships? These are the sort of resources that, like, when people lose their healthcare, do you have doctors in your congregation who are willing to use the religious education classroom on Thursday nights to see community members? Like very, very concrete commitments that actually are not about changing your budget, because that's when UUs get stuck all the time, because we have this pervasive myth of scarcity about we're never going to fund the budget. But like, what are the actual infrastructural resources, the human resources, the theological resources, the relationships that you already have with organizations in your community? And it becomes about leveraging rather than like a charity model. So part of this organizing is around like having relationships where we say, our local organizing collective that's working with undocumented folks, here are some things that we think might be useful, but I don't actually know if they are going to be or not. Like, what could be, what else could we be looking for our people for? And then we have those congregational conversations where we get buy-in from folks, So like, you don't have to slow down the process when somebody comes to you and says, we have a really quick turnaround on something, we need X number of dollars, or we need this resource or whatever, because you've already got it organized. It's ready to go. And I think that we, liberals, in general, like we kill movements with bureaucracy, not with overt resistance. And so the more nimble, the more agile we can be right now, I think the better equipped we will be to actually show up in solidarity and have those conversations framed as covenantal conversations about the stewardship of our resources, not just individually, but collectively. What do we have to offer? How can we be prepared to say yes?
Okay. So Ashley, is it time to close out, I think? We're just going to let people know about the debrief next week?
Great, sure. So speaking of things, I think next steps for all of us are to sort of approach this march as a piece of a ongoing praxis, right? So we've all done some reflection tonight, thinking about like the political moment we're in. All of us have been in other spaces other than this webinar too. We're all going to have, or those of you who are going and participating are going to have these experiences of actually being in the all of the wonderful and awful things that happen when you're with, a million of your closest friends. And, I hope that you will approach that experience through some of these lenses that we've offered and listen with those ears that hear and eyes that see. And then we invite you to come back with us for a debrief webinar on February 8th at this same time. 7 p.m. Eastern and 4 p.m. Pacific, is that right? Am I, Nora? Sorry.
8 p.m. Eastern.
8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, thank you. And we'll be doing some of that work of like, what were the things that you noticed? What kind of energy did it give you? What kind of fears did it bring up for you? How do we address those? How do we make this more than a one-shot moment and move into the future in powerful ways with this experience as a part of our repertoire? So please do join us for that. Nora and the good standing on the side of the love folks will be sending out more registration information about that too. And I think at that point too, I think we can have also some really concrete conversations about sort of what this looks like in our congregations and next steps. Because I hear that a lot of you are yammering for that, hankering for that, whatever the word is. So I want to invite all of us again to close out. We'll take a deep breath together. Close your eyes or sit with your feet on the floor, however helps you to get centered again. Spirit of life, God who stands on the side of those who are pushed out from the center and toward the margins. Help us connect deeply with our fellow human beings. Help us understand when we are being motivated by anxiety or fear, and when we're being motivated by our deepest values. Some of the values lifted up by this group tonight: courage, resistance, solidarity, worth, dignity, freedom, liberation. Help us to reach out and find hands to hold in our congregations and beyond. Help us to act out of that deep, soul-centered place of our values. Help us to ask how we can be useful, while also not always waiting for somebody to come up with the perfect action plan. May we carry with us the knowledge that we are, in fact, the architects of collective liberation with all those who share those values. We are, in fact, the agents of salvation to one another. In that spirit, love us, free us, connect us, inspire us, push us forward. Blessed be, Ashe and Amen.
Thank you, Ashley.
Yes, thank you. Thank y'all for coming. And take care and travel with ease.
Safe travels, everyone.